Hello again. I'm Paulo Shakarian, CEO and co-founder of Cyricon. Thanks for taking the time to watch today. We have an important topic to discuss. And that topic deals with low and medium CVSS vulnerabilities. So let's talk about Heartbleed, probably one of the most famous vulnerabilities discovered in the past decade. Heartbleed affected over 17% of SSL-enabled websites, including some very important sites such as Google. Even well after the vulnerability was disclosed and fixes were made, there still are tens of thousands of sites in the United States that are vulnerable to this flaw. And of course, there's numerous exploits available. But here's the rub. The NIST CVSS scoring system assigned this as a medium when it came out. Now let's take a look at the NIST CVSS scoring system. It's a number from 1 to 10. And when you look at the numbers, they fall into buckets as in the most current numbering system: critical, high, medium, low, etc. Now, very often vulnerability management programs have requirements around patching high and critical vulnerabilities in a certain amount of time. Unfortunately, this often leads to the case where low and medium vulnerabilities are ignored. Now, how is this produced? Well, essentially what NIST is doing is they are taking characteristics about the vulnerability present in the disclosure and using them to calculate the CVSS score. And they have a nice calculator online that you can sort of play around with it and understand the drivers of the score. They even provide the underlying equations that show how these factors combine together in the underlying score. You could write your own code if you wanted to. But unfortunately, there's nothing here dealing with what the threat is actually looking at. There's nothing really intelligence driven. And it's not designed that way. It's designed just to be a more generic picture of risk. Now let's actually look at vulnerabilities that are exploited and not exploited, and both in peer-reviewed studies by our own research as well as several other researchers in the field have identified that there isn't too much significant difference between the CVSS score of vulnerabilities that are exploited or those that are not. And also, if you look at some very prevalent vulnerabilities that came up in a lot of attacks or large-scale attacks, such as the Microsoft Equation Editor vuln that accounted for 37% of malware downloads, that one's sort of flirting at the border between medium and high. Even Eternal Blue vulnerability used in WannaCry, this was not at the highest level. And the week that was disclosed, there were 60 other vulnerabilities that had a higher CVSS score. And so it becomes very difficult to determine the level of threat based on CVSS scoring. Now, how do you overcome this? Well, there's really three things that we strongly advise on. First, don't ignore the non-high and critical CVSS scored vulnerabilities. We see these exploited way too much to think this is a risk worth taking. And as the previous chart showed you, the non-high critical vulnerabilities are really exploited at the same rate as the high and critical ones. Second, it's, I think, really important to separate out the threat aspect of the risk analysis for each vulnerability. And so don't view CVSS as that threat aspect. You need to look at something different. And ideally, getting to point 3, that item to understand the threat aspect of the risk is to use threat intelligence and have threat intelligence inform your vulnerability prioritization process. And we have a couple other videos on this too. Anyway, I'd be remiss if I wouldn't talk about our own company's product and how we can address this problem. So right in the user interface, you see listed NIST low score vulnerabilities, and you see these vulnerabilities that are low or medium NIST score and the associated PSI rating, which is based on threat intelligence, is much higher. But again, this is mostly due to the fact that we're driving our scoring based on likelihood of threat, driven by the threat intelligence. And so that's the gap that Cybercon's looking to fulfill. Can you have a threat-based prioritization of vulnerabilities? Anyhow, if you're interested in learning more about that, or just other interesting pieces like this one, please go visit our website. Thank you very much.